This is Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College. This is, of course, week 5 of a history podcast lecture on the rise of fascism in World War II. We're kind of getting down close to, of course, the beginning of World War II, which I'll discuss today. We'll get more into a lot of the major events that, of course, happened the early years of World War II. We likely will not finish World War II. We'll have a third lecture later next week, which will finish up World War II, and then if we have time, we could also talk about the Cold War that comes later. Now, we were up to the point where, of course, Hitler has taken over Nazi Germany. At that point, we kind of talked about his rise to power pretty much in the 1930s. Now, I think we went into and talked about how Hitler had started to take over various aspects of Europe, such as the Rhineland was taken back. 1936 forms the Axis powers with Italy, which later includes Japan in 1940. Of course, also took over what is Austria, Anschluss, it's called, of course, and annexation of that into Greater Germany or the German Reich. Now, I think we talked about the incident over the Sudetenland crisis, dealing with Czechoslovakia, and of course the Western powers, Britain, France, decided to give in to Hitler's demands. They gave him the western half, and of course he took the eastern half too. And so at that point, Hitler's starting to plan his next big move in 1939, which of course is the invasion of Poland. So he started, they think, planning this way back in the spring of 1939. And before, of course, he did this, he began to make some alliances with powers in Europe. The first thing he did, of course, he made this alliance with Italy, which was like a political military alliance, which was called later the Pact of Steel. It was signed on May the 22nd, 1939. And both Italy and Germany kind of signed a mutual agreement to help each other out militarily, economically, in case of like war breaking out in Europe. So basically, Italy is, pretty much solidified as the ally of Germany in World War II as part of the Axis powers. And later in 1940, they had the Tripartite Pact signed on September 27, 1940. That includes Japan in there too as well. Then a surprise thing had happened in August of 1939, signed on August 23rd, the Non-Aggression Pact that was signed between Germany and the Soviet Union. Of course, it's got all kinds of nicknames. Its most common nickname is actually the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And those two were both diplomats of Germany and the Soviet Union. Molotov was a Soviet diplomat, and Ribbentrop was a foreign minister of Nazi Germany. And Ribbentrop actually flew to Soviet Union to meet with Stalin and Molotov. They agreed to this 10-year deal where Germany and the Soviet Union wouldn't fight war. So it was signed August 23rd, and this was really important to Hitler because Hitler was, planning to invade Poland, and so this would basically prevent him having to fight a two-front war like the Germans did in World War I. So that was part of the agreement there, and of course there was some other agreements with it too, which was kind of secretive, but they agreed that if the Nazis invaded Poland, they would give the Soviets the eastern half of Poland. The Germans would occupy the western half. I think also the Germans were going to allow the Soviets to pretty much control the Baltic states areas, which I think if you look at this map here, I don't know if it's there or not, but Latvia and Lithuania were the main countries that were part of it, in which the Soviets will eventually control. So that was the deal made pretty much before, World War II broke out in September of 1939. Then, of course, the Germans invaded Poland. That's what touched off, World War II. And the Germans had been planning this, like I said, since the spring. The actual invasion plans were called Case White. And, of course, it involved an invasion which would come from multiple angles. They would invade eventually from mostly what is Germany, you can see, East Prussia. I think also they invaded from Slovakia, which was what was left of Czechoslovakia after the Germans had taken it over. And so the Germans massed their forces in late August. And on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland, and that's what started World War II. So within 2 days after that, Britain and France declared war on Germany. So at this point, you now had Germany fighting France and Britain. And Italy, of course, would later come in on the side of the, of course, Germans a little later in the war. And they stayed neutral at first. And Poland got overrun pretty quick. You can see in that map the actual invasion of Poland probably lasted maybe 3 to 4 weeks. I think it's like September 17th, a lot of the Polish forces began to surrender at that point. And you can also see that the Soviets came in on the other side. And they took over the eastern part of Poland too, as well. So Germany and the Soviet Union split in half, but the Soviet Union stayed neutral in the war. It's kind of weird about that. I never could figure that out about that. But Britain and France didn't declare war on the Soviet Union, only on Germany. So Poland's wiped off the map at that point. Now, the offensive type warfare that the German forces use in Poland, the newspapers start calling it blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. And of course, the Germans showcased a new type of warfare in World War II that became prevalent in the first few years of it. That was a type of warfare where they used like tanks and trucks, mechanized forces, along with a lot of fighter aircraft and bombers, like Air Forces being used with it. They were able to like conquer vast amounts of territory in a very short time. So that's something that the Germans are able to do, over a period of like 2-3 years that they do this. And the Germans, I think at one point, overrun like 12, 13 states within a matter of a couple years overall. Now, with the fall of Poland, pretty much gone at that point, if you know about the war then went into a strange period from 1939 to 1940, which is called the Phoney War, usually spelled Phoney. The Phoney War lasted about 8-9 months from 1939 to 1940. What was it? It was a lull in the war where there was very little fighting going on between the Allies versus the Germans. And I think there was a little bit of fighting here and there. I know like in the West, they were kind of maybe trying to fight a little along the Western front, like between the French and German border. I'll get to it later, but Germany invades Scandinavia. And then they do have some naval campaigns that are fought in the Atlantic where Hitler tried to send out these like pocket battleships to attack mostly Allied shipping and so on. But that's about it. There wasn't too much fighting going on both sides. The Germans had a nickname for it. They called it the Sitzkrieg, or sit-down war. Yeah, sit-down war. And like the West didn't think Hitler was going to attack them. And the Germans thought that the war wasn't really going to last that long and that the West was going to sue for peace with Hitler. So nobody knew kind of what was going to happen. at that point. But Hitler had a plan, about this. He had been, like, over the winter time, he had been planning what he was going to do with the West. And so he came up with this new invasion plan that had different names. It was either called Case Yellow, is one name they called it, or some people called it the Manstein Plan, which was named after von Manstein, who was a German general under Hitler. Yeah, Erich von Manstein. He was one of their best generals. And the Manstein Plan was a plan where they were going to attack the West and take over Holland, Belgium, France. And what they would do is the Germans decided that the best way to attack the West would be to attack through Belgium, like what was done in, World War I and the Franco-Prussian War. And the French, like between the wars, World War I and World War II, the 1930s, built a defensive line on their eastern border with Germany. It was called the Maginot Line. It was named after the French defense minister named André Maginot. And they built like a system of forts up and down their eastern border, thinking that the Germans would attack there eventually. However, the Germans figured out that that wasn't the best way to attack the French, and they decided the best way to be just go around it. And so the Germans decided that the best way to attack was to go through Belgium, through kind of a weak area, which was called the Ardennes Forest. The Ardennes Forest was this forest that was kind of like between like the French and the Belgian border. And the British and the French didn't put a whole lot of forces there. They didn't think that, the Germans could get that many troops through there. And what Hitler decided to do in 1940, he decided to gamble. And what he did was, I think they say Hitler kind of tweaked the Manstein Plan or whatever, but he decided that he would put like close to, I want to say almost 80% of his tank forces through the Ardennes Forest, try to break through there. And so on May 10th, that's when they launched the attack on the West, Case Yellow. And of course, what happened was the Germans eventually broke through. This is kind of a so-so map here. But you can see one of the first things that they did was the Germans overran Holland. And then, of course, they then broke through through the Ardennes. They broke through the Ardennes Forest, and they raced to the English Channel. And what eventually happened was they encircled the British and French forces on the northern coast of France and Belgium, which became known as the Dunkirk Pocket, as it was called. And so this Allied pocket formed around what is Dunkirk, which was in northern France. I forget how many troops were surrounded. It was like over 1 million, I think, were surrounded at one point in that pocket. I think 1.7 million may have been trapped at one point, which is a lot. And so what happened was it forced the Allies, mostly the British, to evacuate their troops on the English Channel. So the troops kept backing up to what is Dunkirk, France, which is a port there, northern France. And the British started to bring in all kinds of ships to pick them up, like all the soldiers that were going to try to get out. And so thousands of soldiers lined up on the beaches of Dunkirk to get out. And the operation was later called Operation Dynamo. That's what they called it. And kind of not exact number on how many they would eventually get out, but I think they somewhere like between maybe close to 350,000, more or less, was eventually able to get evacuated. Mostly British forces with maybe some French at that point. And they had to leave all their equipment behind. So all their tanks, trucks, major equipment was all left behind. But they were able to escape to fight again later. But a lot of soldiers like French and British got captured by the Germans. The British put a spin on it. The evacuation at Dunkirk took place between late May to early June 1940. The British call it the Miracle at Dunkirk. You may have heard of that term being used, Miracle Dunkirk. And So it was kind of seen a miracle that they were able to escape to fight again. So at that point, Winston Churchill, was starting to come in, as the prime minister of France. He came to power in May of 1940, just in time to see the disaster of the Battle of France, as they start calling this, of course, later. And Churchill realized that they were really up against what is almost like the Dark Ages. The fact that it looked bad with Europe, and the fact that the Nazis were going to overrun Europe and all that. And so he'll basically take power as basically the Battle of France is raging at that point. So he kind of comes in a bad time, Neville Chamberlain resigned due to sickness. He was ill, but I guess he was kind of also resigned in somewhat disgrace at that point. So from there, the Battle of France raged. The Battle of France lasts about 6 months. May 10th, I think, is when it started, and it goes all up to like maybe June 22nd when it officially ended. And after the Dunkirk pocket was closed, the Germans had invaded France, and France just collapsed. Their government, their military, just basically just got beat bad in a couple of weeks. And the French army began the mass retreat. And the people did too. There was a case where the people started like a mass retreat to get away from the Nazis. And the Germans on, I think, June the 16th took Paris at that point. And then 6 days later, on June 22nd, the French signed an armistice to end the war with the Germans, which was, by the way, signed the same place where World War I ended. It was in the Forest Compiègne. It was actually signed in the same rail car as when the generals signed the armistice at the end of World War I, November 11th. So Hitler kind of got his revenge for what happened in 1918 when the Germans lost. And he basically made the West eat crow. And I think later he took the rail car that they had signed it and he blew it up. So I guess in case they want to use it again. Now, what happened after the French lost to the Germans? 1940. Well, the Germans then took France and they split it up into two areas. They put it into like two regions, two zones. The northern part was occupied France. So you had an occupied zone where the Germans occupied like mostly the northern part, especially on the Atlantic and the English Channel. In the southern part, southern zone, was an unoccupied area, like a free zone, they call it. But it had a nickname. It was called Vichy France. And Vichy France was this pro-Nazi French government that they installed in France. And the French brought out this old French general who had been like the hero of Verdun. You may remember him, named Marshal Pétain. And Marshal Pétain became the leader of Vichy France. He was like its president. And about 2-3 years, it was like a free zone. And then I think by November of 1942, the Germans came in and occupied the southern part later as well. So the French were kind of forced to collaborate with the Germans and all that. They even turned over like Jews in France that were there, and the Germans all sent them to, concentration camps and all that in the Holocaust. And part of why they created like this Vichy France was because they were worried that the colonies of the French Empire, and I think they're also their navy, would rebel, and that was the reason for it. And a lot of the French didn't want to support the Allies in the war, at least in the beginning of the war, because they were losing. They didn't want to be on the losing side. And so up until like 1942, 43, it would be a while until the French decide to switch sides and, of course, back the Allied side later. Now, there were some French that, of course, backed the Allies. There was a famous French general you probably heard of named Charles de Gaulle. And de Gaulle left France. He escaped, went to England, like Britain, He formed his own French government in exile, which became known as Free France. Yeah, Free France it was called. And this was a government exile in London, and it also formed a military force of mostly French soldiers that fled. That was called the Free French Forces. And so the Free French were important, Free France, because they helped also kind of start the whole French resistance movement in France to try to sabotage the German effort to control France. And that was something that de Gaulle was behind. So the whole French resistance movement you've probably heard of before was basically connected with de Gaulle and the Free France exile movement. That was in Britain. Later, when the Allies invade France in 1944, of course, de Gaulle will lead the Free French forces against the Germans and to take back, France and Paris and all that. But we'll get to that later in 1944. All right, so with France fallen at that point, what happens next is that then Hitler begins planning to attack Britain. And I told you, at this point, Churchill's the only, him and Britain's the only country really fighting the Nazis at that point, which is like looking like a dark ages. In fact, almost close to a year, the British fought alone. From June 1940 to June 1941, they fought alone with no help. Though I think the United States started giving them some aid at that point. And Churchill, was famous for giving a lot of speeches. And I think his first great speech he gave was the Never Surrender speech, where he said that they'll fight anywhere. They'll fight on the beaches, they'll fight in the seas, they'll fight on the islands, and basically never give up, never surrender. Churchill was famous for a lot of great speeches and was probably one of the most famous politicians in World War II. I think the other ones would be probably Stalin and maybe Franklin D. Roosevelt in the United States. So he was a great leader. I think the Russians gave him a nickname. He was called the Bulldog. This might be one of his most famous pictures of him. Usually you'll see pictures of him, he usually has a cigar in his mouth. But that's kind of a rare one without it. Now, what happened next? Now, Hitler decided he was going to invade what is Britain at this point. And, of course, he had already taken over Holland, Belgium, France. Also, the Germans had taken over Denmark. And also, I forgot to talk about Norway. They took over Norway also as well, which Norway was really strategic because the Germans could use that to attack the North Sea in Britain. They could have bases there, naval air bases there. They could have bases in France to attack Britain as well. And in Norway, I think they put in this Norwegian dictator who was named Quisling. Yeah, Quisling. What was his first name? I think it was Vidkun. I think his name Vidkun Quisling was his name. And the term Quisling later became what the Norwegians would call a traitor, basically. But the French the Germans would use Norway and Britain to try to attack. Yeah, Norway and France would be used to attack Britain in 1940, and that led to the Battle of Britain, which happened mostly in the fall of 1940. It goes from mostly around July to about October. And Hitler at that point had been trying to plan to invade Britain, which the actual invasion plans were called Operation Sea Lion. This was supposed to be an amphibious invasion. And what they were going to do was they were going to use like naval forces, barges, or whatever kind of naval craft to cross the English Channel, and then eventually take over England and Scotland. I'm not sure if they were going to occupy Ireland, but they were probably would have done that too while they're at it. However, they never got to it because the Germans were never successful in neutralizing the Air Force of the British, just the Royal Air Force, RAF. And so the Battle of Britain was more or less an air battle that took place between the British Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe. And it's really considered the first major air battle probably in history. I think pretty much a lot of people think the Battle of Britain was probably the most strategic battle of the war in importance-wise. And what happened was in July, August, the Germans started bombing Britain at that point. And at first what they did was they went after like a lot of the strategic spots, like air bases, radar sites, and so on. But what happened was Churchill got mad about this, and he started bombing Berlin. And so Hitler responded by bombing not just military targets, but they started going after civilian targets. And that led to the so-called Blitz, as they call it, where the Blitz was this German bombing campaign where they tried to basically bomb England into submission, like into basically ending the war. And they didn't just go after military targets, they went after pretty much civilian targets also as well. A lot of it involved like night bombing eventually because daylight raids were kind of too risky and a lot of their planes would get shot down. So the Nazis had to rely a lot on night bombings, which that can lead to easily targeting any kind of target. So yeah, during the war, the English got bombed a lot. And the Blitz itself lasted for several months until like 1941. I think they were, but pretty much the Germans would keep bombing them throughout the war. Something like 50,000 people died in England because of all the different bombing raids by the Germans. And the British kind of had an advantage in the Battle of Britain. At the time, radar was starting to be used, and so the British used that a lot to help detect where the German Luftwaffe's planes were coming in, whether fighters or bombers. So they kind of knew where to attack planes that were coming in, and so that gave them a big advantage. Also, the Germans had to go a longer distance. They were flying from Norway or France or whatever, where they're flying from. They had to, eventually run out of fuel, and so it's a big advantage for the English because they mostly were flying either over England where they were fighting or the English Channel, so they didn't have to fly as far like they did. But yeah, radar played kind of a major role, not just in the air, but also naval campaigns in the future. The Luftwaffe would end up losing more planes than the RAF. They lost over 1,700 fighter planes and bombers, and the RAF lost 1,379 fighters, which is quite a lot. About 414 British fighter pilots were killed in the Battle of Britain. And it proved kind of an important point here with the Battle of Britain, and the fact that the Germans weren't able to be successful in seizing Britain. And so that was something that kept them in the war. And a lot of people view the Battle of Britain as really the first Allied victory of the war, not basically giving in to Hitler and all that. So Hitler was going to go and finish off the British, I think by 1941-42. But if you know about what happened in 1941, Hitler decided to turn his sights towards the Soviet Union and attack them. And so that led to the German invasion of the Soviet Union, in which, of course, sparked what became known as the Eastern Campaign, which the Eastern Campaign was the bloodiest campaign in World War II. More men were killed on that front than any other front in World War II. It mostly pitted Nazi Germany and some of its allies versus the Soviet Union. Soviets had their own nickname for the Eastern Campaign. They called it the Great Patriotic War. And it kind of like instilled a lot of patriotism of being a Soviet citizen, and it kind of, like I said, rehabilitated Stalin as a leader of the Soviet Union. People kind of forgot about the purges that Stalin had done, before the war, and eventually Hitler violated, the non-aggression pact that they had with with the Soviets, which I think lasted about 22 months. And Hitler, on June 22nd, 1941, launched the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was part of a military operation that the Germans called Operation Barbarossa. It was supposed to be a short campaign where they would invade Poland, Ukraine, and the Soviet Union and knock the Soviets out of the war in a few months. I think it was supposed to last maybe 6 months, and that was it. So it was supposed to be like a quick campaign. And quickly, the Germans overrun eastern Poland, which falls pretty quickly. Of course, the Soviets were surprised. Stalin was very shocked. He didn't think that this would even happen, that the Germans would invade the Soviet Union. And the Germans massed something like 3 million troops or more. It's like one of the largest invasions. And then the Germans overran the Ukraine. I think the only city they had trouble taking was Kiev, which was encircled, which eventually fell by the end of 1941. They also attacked Leningrad, and they laid siege to Leningrad. Leningrad was actually laid siege to by Nazi Germany for over 2 years, for about almost 800 days, or around 800 days. That's how long it was. It was one of the longest sieges in world history, but they never took it. And a lot of the civilians of Leningrad suffered greatly. There was a shortage of food, and so many of them starved to death. Close to 1 million people in Leningrad actually died. Leningrad is what the Soviets called St. Petersburg, the Soviet Union. They named it after Lenin. And so like 1 million people died in Leningrad itself. In fact, they got so bad with the lack of food that there was some cases where some of the Soviet citizens, if you know about it, they ate each other. They actually relied on cannibalism to survive and stuff like that. By October and November of 1941, the Germans tried to drive on Moscow. Eventually, it failed. They do think that the Germans got within a few miles, because some of the soldiers claim that they saw some of the buildings, like the tops of the buildings. And the Soviets counterattacked and pushed them back at that point, and then the Russian winter came in and intervened, and it stalled Operation Barbarossa. So the whole thing failed, the initial invasion of the Soviet Union. And the Germans at that point realized that they might have lost the war with not being able to knock the Soviets out of the war and take Moscow. And so, a lot of people believe that that failed invasion was very pivotal in the Eastern Campaign. Because, the Germans will keep trying to attack the Soviet Union in 1942, but pretty much a lot of historians think that the Germans lost the war in 1941 with that failed Operation Barbarossa. So at that point, if you look at this map here, the Germans have overrun a good bit of Eastern Europe. I forgot to talk about the other areas they overran too, but you can see how the Germans even overrun. They pretty much take over Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and also Greece. All those areas are eventually taken over by Nazi Germany. And part of why they went into Yugoslavian I think Greece. I think Yugoslavia, there was a coup there, but I know Greece, the Italians under Mussolini trying to take over Greece. And so Hitler bailed them out in 1941, and so they took over Greece as well. And then they also took over Crete as well. So pretty much the extension of the Nazi conquest went all the way down into the Aegean Sea, and as far east as like Western Russia at that point. So at that point, the Nazis are like in control of like something like 12 or 13 countries in Europe through like 1941 overall. Now, of course, get into the other thing that happens also in 1941. Now, the United States will eventually come in and start aiding the Allies in the war. We joined the war in 1941. Of course, prior to that, the United States stayed neutral. Like at the beginning of the war, from 1939 to 1941, we didn't fight anybody, of course, because we were kind of in an isolationism period between World War I and World War II. There was a lot of mistrust with the European powers because we didn't really want to get involved in another European war. However, by 1939, 1940, the United States realized that Hitler was kind of a threat to the United States. This was under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. So several things happened that were famous. I guess I'll mention, it's not in the notes, but in 1940, the U.S. enacted a draft to try to expand the American military, which was called the Burke-Wadsworth Act, which came out in 1940, passed by Congress. It basically began drafting men between the age of 21 to 35. And or they say it required them to register at that point, and then they would be drafted later. And so there was attempts to try to expand the military under the United States in 1940. Some believe that the war might be coming to us as well, because all these other countries are fighting war. Also, the United States also began aiding Britain and Churchill. Churchill, of course, I think at one point met with Franklin D. Roosevelt and tried to get us to give aid to them. And so the United States, starting in 1941, actually 1930, I think it's 39 is when it is. We also actually began giving them aid at first. There's actually two policies I think we did initially. It's important I need to talk about. They had the cash and carry policy was one thing that the United States did at first. Franklin D. Roosevelt came up with this idea to basically allow the British to come over and pick up like any kind of military arms they needed or naval ships, etc. And they would pay cash for it. And so I think we gave them like a bunch of old destroyers. There was a trade where we also were allowed, they gave us a bunch of bases all over the place. They were part of the British Empire. So the U.S. ends up having bases in the North Atlantic and other parts of the world through some kind of trade with that. And so it became known as the cash and carry policy. Yeah, cash and carry. And a lot of it was like we got land bases, I think was the main thing. They gave us cash for it, but mostly that and land bases is what they gave us. And then they had the Lendlease Act. That's more famous, which was came out in March 1941 that the Congress passed. And the Lend-Lease Act was where we leased out war materials, munitions to the Allied war effort. And it's included like Britain at first, then the Soviet Union, then the Chinese, etc. And Roosevelt kind of compared it to if your neighbor's house was on fire and you need to put it out, you'd give them your garden hose and you'd put it out and he'd give your hose back to you. So it was kind of basically leasing all this equipment to them. And then they were supposed to, I guess, pay us later. I don't know if they'll give us the burned out tank later, that kind of thing. They were supposed to pay us later, but a lot of them never paid us back, you know about that. So the Lend-Lease Act was really an idea to try to help out, you know, those countries. And basically because of that, that's part of why like the Soviets and the British were able to fare better later. Like I think when the British were fighting Rommel in North Africa, they got tanks and other equipment, and we also began sending trucks and jeeps and other things to basically the Soviet Union to help them out also as well. And Churchill called, oh not Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy. The idea to send arms and not men to defeat fascism, in Europe or whatever, Asia. And that was the point of what that was about, so-called arsenal democracy. But eventually we would get sucked into it, into World War II. But it wasn't because of the Germans or anything like that. It was because of Japan. So what happened was in 1941, Japan and the United States had become tangled diplomatically. We were at odds. It was all over, of course, because of Japan's policies in Asia. They were taking over East Asia, Southeast Asia. They were taking over the Pacific. And eventually the Japanese decided in December of 1941 to attack the United States, which was at Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. That caused the United States to enter World War II. We got attacked at Pearl Harbor. All of this was because of the rise of the Japanese Empire, which rose to power kind of between the wars. Between World War I and World War II, Japan became kind of an imperial power. They built up a pretty good naval force and also had a pretty good army. And the Japanese called this empire different names, but one name they called it, which was kind of a nickname that became popular in the 1940s, was the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And it was this idea to have this Asia for Asians with no like foreign powers like Europeans interfering in Asia, but an Asia for Asians with Japan on top. And the Japanese were kind of racist on the fact that they thought they were better than other Asians. Like the Japanese were better than the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and whoever else that was there. Koreans, they're all better than the Koreans, and so on. And so it kind of influenced their military and all of that. And eventually the Japanese in the 1930s began to take over part of China. In 1931, as you know, the Japanese, at this point they already controlled Korea since around World War I. But from Korea, they hopped into Manchuria in 1931, and they took it over. And they took Manchuria, just kind of like northeastern part of China, and they made it into like a Japanese puppet state that was called Manchukuo. And the Japanese wanted to control Manchuria because it had a lot of natural resources. And so that's one thing that they start taking over is that at that point. Then in 1937, the other thing that happened, of course, was Japan then tried to attack and take over mainland China, eastern China especially. And so this started the Second Sino-Japanese War, it's usually called, which lasts from 1937 to 1945. It's one of the longest, really, campaigns in World War II. It was actually the second bloodiest behind the Eastern Campaign. Close to 10 million Chinese died in basically the Sino-Japanese War we're talking about. And Japan wanted to seize especially the eastern part of China, where all the main ports are and cities. And so starting in 1937, they launched attacks on different cities like Beijing, Nanking, Hong Kong, and so on, Shanghai as well. And they basically overrun like the eastern part and take all the major cities. And one of the worst incidents that happened at the beginning of the war was you know about this, I think it was like close to December 1937, the Kwantung Army, which is the main Japanese army in China, overran and they took, Nanking or Nanjing, as they call it, which was, I think, at that point, the capital of the Republic of China. And the Japanese armies just massacred the civilians, raped a lot of the women, killed many, many people, like thousands of people were killed. I'm not sure how many it was. It may have been six figures at the most. But that led to what they call the rape of Nanking, which became notorious. And it was actually pretty much, the West pretty much knew about it. It was, they had even video footage from it. It was all in the newspapers. And so it was a perfect example of atrocities that were committed by, Axis powers that were in the war. Germany would do the same thing, during the Holocaust also as well. The Japanese were, they hated a lot of people and would execute people left and right, even like soldiers that surrendered, which they thought was cowardly. So China gets overrun at that point. So the British, the United States would back the Chinese, and so Churchill, sent reinforcements to try to help out the Chinese forces. The Chinese were led by this Chinese dictator and kind of president of China, who was named Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek was real close with the United States later. And we gave him a lot of arms and weapons. And we also sent volunteers to fight with him. And the British soldiers also fought with Chiang Kai-shek as well. The British mostly tried to invade up through like where Thailand is, like in Southeast Asia, because at one point the Japanese, if you know about it, overran pretty much Southeast Asia. They took it over. They also started taking over the Western Pacific, because eventually the Japanese will overrun like the Philippines and other islands that are in the Pacific. So, the United States began to support Chiang Kai-shek. There were cases where I think it was a volunteer group that went over there right before the war broke out with the Japanese, which was called the American Volunteer Group, that was famously known as the Flying Tigers. The Flying Tigers was a American volunteer air force that went over there to help out the Chinese Air Force. It was led by this American general named Claire Chennault. It was from Texas at one point, but actually went to LSU. And he later became known as the Flying Tigers. And basically later in the war, they were actually a separate air force that fought against the Chinese. Then, of course, the U.S. put an embargo on Japan, and that led to the Japanese planning to attack Pearl Harbor. And so what happened was, in 1941, the Japanese in their Navy basically planned an attack on Pearl Harbor. Why Pearl Harbor? Well, Pearl Harbor, which was in Hawaii, was where the headquarters of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was. And so Admiral Yamamoto, who was the head of the Imperial Japanese Navy, realized that they could take out the U.S. Pacific Fleet, that they could then take over the Pacific easy. So what happened was in 1941, usually like in the fall, the Japanese amassed a huge carrier task force to attack Hawaii. It was called the First Air Fleet. It had 6 aircraft carriers and a bunch of other ships. And they took these ships and they sailed them up through the North Pacific. And in early December of 1941, this Japanese naval force then came down on where Hawaii is. And on December 7th, 1941, as you know, they launched a series of air attacks on Oahu. Oahu, of course, had, Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was where we had our best, capital ships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet there. Most of them were like battleships. We also had our aircraft carriers, but of course we got lucky and they weren't there. And on the morning of December 7th, 1941, which was a Sunday, the Japanese launched 2 attacks on us, which took out our main ships there, and also our air bases that were on Oahu. And their main target was Battleship Row. Battleship Row was where we had our best battleships there. And like you may have heard of the Tennessee, Arizona, Oklahoma. Those were some of the ships that were there. And anyway, at the 6 a.m., I think is when they launched the attack itself. They basically, the first wave came in, did most of the main damage, which took out most of our main battleships there. The two worst ships hit were the Arizona, which was totally destroyed in the attack. Most of the crew were killed, like 80% or more of the crew was actually killed in the attack. Also the Oklahoma, that was another ship hit bad. It actually almost sunk too, or actually flipped over on its side. And most of the men, a lot of men were killed on that ship as well. About 90% of the, like they say, 89% of the crew, I thought that died in the attack were mostly on those two ships overall. And the U.S. would have, it's like the U.S. Navy would have like something like 18 ships that were sunk or damaged in the actual attack. So they later call it the Battle of Pearl Harbor. It is one of the worst naval defeats that the United States ever suffered, like in history as a whole. But all the ships, I think, were mostly refloated, like you read about later, except for the Oklahoma and Arizona never were. And of course, the Arizona is now a memorial. 1,200 men were killed on the Arizona when it blew up. Over 2,400 sailors and soldiers and civilians were killed with the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so this really angered the United States with the Japanese attacking us. And so that basically got the United States involved in World War II. And so the next day, on December 8th, 1941, FDR and the U.S. Congress declared war on Japan, which was known later as the Day of Infamy. I think some people call it December 7th. I think FDR called it a dastardly attack because of the way it was kind of seen almost as like a sneak attack. And so within a few days after that, what happens is the Germans and the Italians declare war on the United States. And so basically by January 1941, the United States is at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. So that's how the United States got in the war, because of Japan and not Germany. But we'll get to it later. What's going to happen in 1942 is that the United States sees Germany as the stronger of the power. And so U.S. has this America First policy of going after the Germans, really, to take them out first, the most, and then finish the Japanese last, which they will later. So we're going to shift over, talk about the end of the war from 1942 to 45 in a part 3 that's coming up probably next week, I guess week 6. And so the last week, I guess I'll try to, whatever I can do on the World War II and whatever we can do on the Cold War. That'll be coming up later. So that ends this podcast.